answer that with a hypothetical. That's culture. It's a culture of knowledge. The ultimate puritanical breach is in coming in and sweeping all of that and deconstructing all of that. But if the theological theological foundations of the Puritan orientation don't just strike me as problematic, but a thorough impoverishment of the Islamic civilizational heritage that take away the very tools that have allowed Islam to thrive for all these centuries. I mean, the Quranic text, by its nature, I mean, the number of verses that have a closed meaning, or what are commonly known as the hudud verses, right? They're quite limited. But the number of verses that actually engage you in an open process is the predominance of the Quran. They engage you either at whether intuition or spiritual or rational. Now, how, with this new reality, what is to become of Islam, I think is the real question. I mean, I don't think anything is inevitable. But if that is the mechanism by which Islam produced and sustained and spread and engaged humanity, avoiding becoming a tribal identity or a private club in which access is severely limited unless you have the keys of specific narrations, of specific reports through specific transmissions. Because notice that what the paradigm shift is a paradigm shift in authoritativeness. So you can no longer, if the puritanical shift is successful, this guy Denor, for instance, his Islamicity is not judged by its impact on the believers or by its historical rootedness, but by the chains of transmissions of the texts that the Wahhabis accept. Then what next? And that is really a question that I struggle with. What next? Any thoughts?
I don't have an answer to that, but I wonder if you would mind if I asked, just backtracking a little bit, something that you said. First of all, who was it that you said who talked about a kind of progressive development of a moral sense? You said that at this stage it would not be appropriate to allow slavery.
That was not. It's responding specifically. It was Ibn Rushd himself, Averroes, and you'll find it in Bidayat al-Mujtahid, where he talks about the sale of slave girls. And and then you also, if you want to if you read Ibn Tufayl, and here you can see the evolutionary theology quite clear, where he talks about human beings in their primitive state, and then they can only understand things through miracles, and then they evolve. But you can even in the theology, even in the works of more famous, if you will, people like Ibn Rajab or Subki or Al-Han Tawheed is an obvious case, but let's see, I can visualize the book, but what's his name? Ibn Abi Dunya. Even if you just start reading in their texts, and you pick up, because by the way, a lot of these theological texts have not been published. But the way you pick it is that they make reference to them, or you can see that it is assumed in the text, and then you can go and explore either manuscripts or some of the material that was published especially from the beginning of the 20th century up to the 70s. Because after the 70s, there's a real impoverishment of publication of really any theological texts other. But there is a text that was published, a manuscript that was published in London, rather telling, it's called the Mu'tamad. I can't remember the name of the author now, but I can email it to you once I get back to the U.S. because I went to great lengths to get that book. And that's a full theological manuscript that actually develops this. It was published in London, according to the editor. It's because he found it very difficult to get it published in the Arabic, which talks about this evolutionary notion, as it says basically that the culmination of perfection of akhlaq is in the Prophet. But the akhlaq of and also you find this quite a bit of an akhlaq literature. I mean, especially books on akhlaq al-Rasul, but general books on akhlaq, ethics and so on. That it is not, the akhlaq of the Prophet are not an imitation of, here he was responding particularly to Nawawi. And Nawawi sort of summed up the akhlaq of al-Rasul in the sort of protocol or adab things that have to do with how you walk, how you eat, how you dress, and so on. And they're actually, in Islamic theology, they're often known as, there's a term, not al-furu' actually, they're known as al-hawamish or al-muhammashat. I'll remember the word, but basically it's a word that means meaning the marginal. And here the response to Nawawi is that it is dangerous to write about akhlaq and tell the laity that the way that they practice akhlaq is to read the literature on adab, because adab is what, and also by the way, you'll find this is in Shatibi's Muwafaqat, as I'm talking, I'm like remembering, and in al-Furuq by Qarafi. It says it, and also, sorry, Sarakhsi in his Mabsut also says something quite similar. And actually, in my own writing, I quote Sarakhsi's text and Shatibi's text, especially in a book, The Search for Beauty in Islam. That book, if you're interested in this material, actually, that book talks quite a bit about these very theological orientations. You say, well, the adab, they're contextual. What passes for good adab in Medina is very different from that in Egypt, and is very different from that in Morocco. And Shatibi gives actually examples of things that people do that are offensive in Maghreb and that are not offensive in Egypt, and so on and so forth. And then he says, but the adab is not the akhlaq. There's a difference between adab and akhlaq. And the Mu'tamad in his book, he criticizes Nawawi. He says he gives the laity the impression that the adab and the akhlaq are one. And that the perfection of akhlaq, when the Quran says to the Prophet, وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَىٰ خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ, right, is a set of ethical qualities such as mercy, forgiveness, justness, truthfulness, so on, that will affect your behavior, will at times dictate your behavior, but your behavior does not define their substance. So, an example often used is saying, well, the behavior of the Prophet in eating or drinking is not going to tell you anything about your consciousness towards husn wa qubh, what is ugly and what is beautiful. Because you can imitate all the practices, and فممكن أن تتبع السنة كلها وتظل قبيحة. You may imitate all the adab and you still remain an ugly person. Right? And here, the internal ugliness, you remain addictive and so on. And especially the Quranic, the prophetic tradition, which says that the talking to converts, and it says that the most ethical of you before Islam are the most ethical of you after Islam. Meaning that Islam itself is not, it's actually خياركم في الجاهلية خياركم في الإسلام, and خياركم is that's a very well-known tradition. The best of character of you in Islam is the best of character you after Islam. In other words, Islam is not what defines your moral character. It's not what defines whether أنت خير أو غير خير. Are you an ethical person or not an ethical person? Islam opens up a dynamic that if you understand and embrace, you increasingly engage in the process of shahada, of knowledge, and that dynamic is what changes your ethical character. So, one of the things you often find, even in stuffy theological works, even if you, someone is sort of juristic, and like Imam al-Haramain, al-Juwayni, a text is rather popular among Westerners. The question, the hypothetical is say, is it possible for someone to have reached full iman, and iman here is the true embodiment of the relationship of Islam to God, and remain a person of ill character, and the response you even get from stuffy jurisprudential authority like Germany says, well, no, it is possible for someone to become a Muslim. It is possible for someone to practice rituals and remain a person of bad character. But a person who من أدرك الحق لم يكن إلا حق. That who becomes that truly achieves consciousness of truth, that's a cleansing process that affects your attitude, your conduct, your demeanor, and that's, for instance, why the reports about the Prophet, and actually this is a really good example because it says, okay, we all know the reports about the Prophet that he never lost his temper, right? Never yelled at anyone. The people who say, oh, I worked as his servant, or I served him 20 years, never raised his voice, and so on. And say, okay, what if someone following the Sunnah of the Prophet never yelled at anyone, but every time someone offended him, internally, they cursed them out or cussed them out, or, and just لعنه في نفسه لعنة, curse him, or is that person of equal ethical character to the Prophet? And and again, these hypotheticals put theologians in a position where either your theology has to respond to the hypothetical in a systematic fashion, or you have a tension that you have to resolve. Because even a Tahawi would say, no, they're not equal. This person is not internally forgiving. His calm is of course is better than a person that yells and so on, but his internal is not consistent with his external, and a true iman is a state of harmony between the external and the internal, etc., etc. And now, of course, Tahawi goes back to sort of the legalistic position of saying, yes, but they're not the same. But in the eyes of God, the fact that he made his behavior compliant, externally compliant, is good enough. He attains the highest levels of, and here's while the Tahawi and the Puritanism generally says that we follow the Sunnah of the Prophet, but at the same time there's this consistent notion. Well, you can attain the higher levels of pleasing the divine in the hereafter without attaining without a true replication of the spirit of the Prophet, because the Prophet was an exception as a prophet. Mm-hmm. So in other words, it's as if in its typical fashion, it claims to put religiosity center stage, but in many ways marginalizes it. Mm-hmm. Because then it says, okay, so basically what God expects from you is external compliance, but God doesn't expect you to be of the ethical character of the Prophet because he was a prophet. So you've created him as an exception that can be externally imitated, but internally is largely irrelevant, it seems to me.
It sounds like, intellectually, it sets the stage for really a real decay of spirit. Without being too dramatic, it sounds as if you really internalize those values, which, not everybody inside Arabia does, presumably, but if you really do believe those things, or you even secondarily pick it up in the discourse of the place or the community, that it has a real decaying effect on your...
Well,
because from the point of view, at least, just from the Sufi tradition, is that, that the inward is, from more orthodox Sufi traditions, that of course the inner and the outer have to be balanced. but without the inner, there really is.
There isn't anything.
It's in a sense primary in that way.
Yeah. No, and it
You
is. I mean, in fact, that is the majority. I mean, if you ask most scholarly authorities on Islamic theology, they would say that is the dominant position in Islamic theology, is that without the internal, you have nothing. And you're right about this notion of impoverishment, because I mean, in the times that I've lived in the Gulf for many years, and including Saudi Arabia, you're struck by the inconsistencies and hypocrisy. I mean, the sort of the hypocrisy that reminds you of the hypocrisy of the puritanical West in like Victorian England. You know, the hypocrisy of the Victorians. And also very compartmentalized lives. So you'll find someone who goes to the mosque, prays 5 times a day, for instance, but will treat his employees like crap. I mean, and steals their money and without any compassion, without any mercy. And then this just the sheer scale of injustices. So, for instance, how do you explain the experience of millions of people from Bangladesh or India or Philippines or even Arabs who are treated as badly, that the treatment that they get in Saudi Arabia is far from beautiful, far from merciful, far from kind. In fact, it is demeaning, degrading, brutalizing. But you say, okay, well, but this is in a country that is outwardly very religious. So what is going on here? But then you discover that this is really, it's as if it is the inevitable creation of the theology of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and the way he built on Tahawi and so on. How else is it possible? What other than that is possible? I mean, you even see it all over in Egypt, where I grew up in the villages, for instance. Whether how a woman covered or not, it often depended on numerous. I mean, a lot. Talking about the veil and all that, sort of in villages where a lot of the women and men work in the fields and pull up their jalabiya and tie it in front of them, and get in the mud and so on. And then there's a particular culture that is centered around religion. There's no question, the heart of this culture is Islam, but at the same time is far from dogmatic or absolutist or no one takes roll call about whether you attend the mosque or not, but yet you can feel the spiritual in the air itself, right? But now when I visit like the village I came from, Little Alam, and where the areas where the Puritans have managed to penetrate, I start seeing all the illnesses of hypocrisy and people showing one thing and acting in a very different way, and the deconstruction of culture itself, and which means the breaking of social units, and the creating of a post-modernity that's actually quite deconstructive and quite harmful and quite dehumanizing. But how is it possible? It is because you've come in and you challenge the culture, you've challenged the legitimacy of the culture, the authority of the culture, and you've shifted authority to something that is open to, if kids that engage in certain affectations of piety, they know how to say قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم حدثنا هذا فحدثنا فقال, and so on, and you've produced this dynamic that is similar to a military culture, and how culturally rich can the military be? Anyway, the part that we should now pick up with, because it's quite central, and here I'm going to talk more about the notions of ugliness and beauty and husn and qubh and so on, is okay. So we said the Islam is not just obedience, it is a state of consciousness and so on. But then notice that the state of consciousness is constantly connected, as if interlinked with in Quranic discourse and Islamic theology, with enjoining the good and forbidding the evil. Amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar. Enjoining the good and here, so what does Al-Amr bil-Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar mean? What does enjoining the good and forbidding the evil mean? Because that is often the hook for Puritanism, right? That is often where they say, well, this is our delegated authority to ensure ritualistic compliance and textual compliance and so on. So we need to unpack that and talk. Okay. Sure.
I'm wondering about the construction of the moderation process in the Puritan groups of society. Let's say when we talk about akhlaq or adab, some books that I have read, written by people that can be considered representing Puritan. Yeah, the works of Al-Ghazali, for example, is often cited to give the foundation of the philosophical and ethical concept, values of what akhlaq means, and the basic philosophical ideas of akhlaq, and at the same time, the examples provided in the books, mostly what we call adab, and therefore they emphasize on the one hand the necessity to follow what the prophets did, and at the same time they're trying to develop the idea of consciousness of society. And do you think it's possible to look to find the hybridized Wahhabis?
You mean hybrid?
Yeah. Because let's say the rise and the wave of Puritans in some Muslim countries, including Indonesia, to some extent the actual appearance is what's like what we can see easily in the Middle East, but some others try to refine the idea of Wahhabism by, let's say, refer to the notion of Al-Ghazali.
Right. Yeah, this is, it's really, it's a good question. We know that the tendency in Wahhabism, the lapsing of akhlaq and adab, and but the use of Ghazali is actually it's a good example, because Ghazali, in Ihya Ulumuddin, there are texts where he clearly, basically, seems to, the way he interacts with the laity is to tell them, okay, this is what you do. But then there are other parts, and remember, this is not a small text. This is, it's what I've noticed in rampant in modern Muslim culture is the sort of very selective quotation of an authority like Ghazali. But other parts of the text where Ghazali clearly talks about, it differentiates between sort of the superficial and the more meaningful, and that's actually the whole key to his mysticism. And what I found very interesting is while Ihya Ulumuddin, which was really written in an attempt to increase the piety of the masses, will often be cited by Puritans. But do you know that Ghazali wrote a treatise called Al-Akhlaq,